Hi, I'm Gary Morrison. Today I'm interviewing Jim Klein for the History Maker Project. Jim, could you give us an overview of who you are, where you currently work?
Sure. I'm at Florida State University, starting my 4th academic year there. I am the Walter Dick Professor of Instructional Systems Design.
And could you tell us your career path? How did you get to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I'll go back to the idea that I was an elementary school teacher, Gary. And as an elementary school teacher, I discovered that I didn't have a lot of freedom. And freedom was important to me, and I wanted to be able to teach teachers how to be better teachers. So I went to the Florida State in the mid-1980s and went to several departments. I knew I wanted a PhD, and I knew I wanted to teach teachers how to be better teachers. And one hot August day, I met Bob Reeser. And he, well, you know, he's so enthusiastic. He explained to me that the field was psychology, communications, and education. And so I started with my master's degree, got my PhD, and then I spent 23 years as a professor at Arizona State University, where I retired, and a professor emeritus at Arizona State.
Okay. What are some of the major ideas or approaches that have influenced your professional growth?
Ideas and approaches. Well, certainly systems thinking. And that was the reason that I chose to honor Walt Dick when they said, who would you like to honor with this named professorship? And I thought about it, and I thought Walt Dick, because Walt challenged me when I finished my master's degree, and he said, you're still thinking like a teacher, and we need you to be thinking systematically. And so maybe you should go back to teaching. And I spent the summer reflecting on that, you know. And you know, at one point it's like, well, you know, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But then I mean, I really know what he's talking about years later, right? And so systems thinking, I would say, is probably the thing that affects me the most as a thought in our field.
Outside of Walt, who are some other people that influenced you, and in what ways?
Obviously my wife and children, and particularly my wife. In fact, she's an instructional designer, and so she practices it, and have the opportunity to sit around the dinner table talking about instructional design affects my thinking and teaching about what I do. My students affect me in so many ways. I think the thing, you know, if I look at my career, the work with my students and being able to help my students get published, get promoted, become you know, researchers. And I think, you know, we could talk about the big names in the field and all the people who have impacted me, but rather than that, I think I'll leave it at my students and my family.
Okay. When you got started, after you finished your doctorate, what were your research interests and what were your aspirations at that stage of your career?
Sure. When I was going through the doctoral program, I kept a notebook, and I tell my students to do this and write down all the things you think about and you do as a topical interest. So what I had written down, and I had done a lot of work already in, was in the notion of learner control and computer-based instruction. And so when I got to my prospectus, I decided, boy, I had done enough of that. So I spent 6 months in the library looking for a topic for my dissertation, and 6 months later, I said, I think I'll do a study on learner control. So we began doing work on learner control, and then we moved on to looking at strategies for active learning, a lot of stuff on the use of collaboration. But being kind of a contrarian, you know, people were doing work on learner control and computer-based instruction. So I decided that we should look at it in instructional televised lessons. So we began a series of studies looking at how you can collaborate during televised instruction. And we were using some materials that had been developed by the Iowa television network had developed these materials, and it was teaching people about instructional design. So we did a series of studies on collaboration, and of course then we did stuff on, you know, collaboration in the schools using computers, collaboration in a nuclear power plant to teach Homer Simpson, you know. So we we did a lot of collaboration research, and then I ended up becoming involved in the competency movement with the Obstipi group, and so we did some work in competencies. And
When did you start with them? Were you one of the earliest groups back in the 70s, or were you?
No. I was in Obstipi in the 90s.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was a fun group because we got a chance to travel all over the world to talk with people in a lot of industries. And so the Obstipi group impacted me quite a bit. And today, competencies drive, we're looking at a curriculum redevelopment project right now. We're beginning at the level of what competencies should our students have today rather than what they had when it was the people who created the program. So making the program evolve, looking at competencies. So competencies are important to me as well. Mm-hmm. And then performance improvement. When I was at Arizona State, Howard Sullivan, Willie Savigny, and I tried to determine, how can we make our program better? And one thing we decided was that nobody was teaching performance improvement there. And to be competitive with the other programs in the field, we had to teach performance improvement. And so I raised my hand. And so I started researching what it meant and started teaching it, started publishing in it. And so I would say that's another area. So performance improvement would be an important thing that have contributed to my thinking.
Okay. How would you describe your current research?
My current research? Well, clearly my students' interests drive my current research. When I moved to Florida State, I was asked to help put the program back to national prominence. That there had been some, questions about whether or not the program was where it was before. I remember one of my former students I went to school with said, "Jim, you're going to bring the program back to where it was?" And I said, "There's no going back. It's always moving forward." So as we evolve and we look at the current strengths of the faculty in the field, it's clearly not just instructional systems, but it's instructional systems and learning technologies. So why I say that, in answer to your question, is my research questions now are driven by my students' work. However, they're doing work in those areas that I mentioned. So because I have some knowledge about collaborative learning, I've got students doing work in collaborative learning. Because I talk about people influence, Rita Ritchie and I in the design and development research, because I teach my students about design and development research, I have students doing some really fascinating projects in design and development. And then I also am still very interested in active learning. And so I have students doing work with problem-based learning in Malaysia, So my students drive my research interests, and they continue to be in those areas I mentioned before.
Okay. What do you consider, and you've got several years left to work, but to this point, what do you consider some of your best accomplishments and why? Again,
I do believe accomplishments revolve around impact on people. Howard Sullivan said to me one time, if you think about, if you bring a Chinese student to our country and you think about what they might not have in their country, and being able to bring somebody over here and mentor them, and they might find a job in, the DOE in the state of New Jersey or something, but the impact you've had on that young woman's life. And so I think back about the people that I have been able to help. And to me, that's the greatest impact I hope I have. I think the design and development stuff that Rita and I did has been impactful. I think this book that, again, Rita and I and Monica Tracy did, Lloyd Reber said to me the other day, he says, "Oh, I use that book and it's crystal clear." It's like, that's high praise from Lloyd Reber. And so you think about stuff like that, but end of the day, that doesn't matter. It's the impact you have on people.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Over our careers, we've seen a lot of change, a lot of developments in our field. Today, these happen almost too rapidly to take advantage of, but when we started out, it was slow.
Yeah.
So how those changes impacted your research?
Well, you know, you begin how you were trained. And so I was trained as a logical positivist. I was trained as an experimentalist. And so over the years, you know, we lived through the you know, qualitative, quantitative wars, and I used to tell people, well, I'm bitative, because it would raise eyebrows, you know. And, but you think about, so the evolution of methodologies, I mean, my research now is much more qualitative than it ever was. I remember the first time I sent Steve Ross a cooperative learning study, and the reviewers are like, well, did you watch him work? And I'm like, oops, you know? So from then on, it's like, you got to have that, right? And so I think I'm more multi-methods now. And I clearly, you know, I remember one time asking Brent Wilson why he was a constructivist, and he said it was a midlife crisis. And so I've come to understand what he means, you know, in some ways. But I clearly I still am a systems thinker, and but it's like the notion of what's empiricism, it's not just numbers. I mean, I really believe that. So I think how we think about thinking and how we think about studying thinking is some of the most recent developments that not just thinking, learning, teaching, performance. So I'd say those were some of the more recent developments that I've had. But at heart, it's still like, what is the effect of X on Y?
Right. You gotta have that one.
Gotta have that one. You gotta make sure your students understand what an independent variable is.
Right. How do you want to be remembered by your peers in the profession?
So I was very active in the Boy Scouts, right? And one of the parts of the Boy Scouts is the Order of the Arrow. And when you get to the point that you're selected for your service, you don't run for anything, somebody says you're selected for your service, you're given an Indian name, right? And my Indian name in English translates to the friendly helper. And I really that's how I'd like to be remembered.
Good, okay. Finally, you've been to many, many AACT sessions, several than I have. What's the best story you'd like to leave us with? Some experience over the years.
I think that, so Krista Glazewski, who is now at Indiana University, was a student of mine, and she had collected data on problem-based learning. It was, again, one of the early qualitative studies I was involved in. And we had an 8 o'clock session, and so she's a student, we're sitting around, nobody's showing up, and I'm like, on the thing, it's like 7:55, 7:59. It's like, it's okay, Krista. You know, if somebody doesn't show up, well, one person ended up showing up. It was David Merrill. and you know, what impacted me about that, it was like, and I said to David, you know, what are you doing here? And he says, I'm looking for empirical evidence for the first principles, and this is a study on problem solving and problem-based learning. And so the three of us had a conversation for about an hour. And I mean, what impressed me in two ways about that is always be prepared, because you never know who's going to show up. And I mean, here's David Merrill, you know? I mean, and so I'd like to be like that. I'd like to be able to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and go to a session to hear a graduate student talk. And so the first thing I did, Gary, when I came to this conference was I went to the introductory session by the GSA. And I just sort of sat there and listened to what they had to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate it.
It's interesting because I see two parallels in our careers. You said, as a teacher, you didn't have freedom.
Yes.
I worked for Tinacoa Company. I already had a doctorate. I was an instructional designer, and I was up in San Antonio. I knew Claire Weinstein.
Yeah.
And she said, well, come talk to my class. She's an ed psych. And so I'm there talking about all the great things doing instructional design and everything and all this. She says, but there's one difference between us, Gary. I said, what? She says, I can go back to my office now, and I can change the direction of my research 180 degrees. You can't. And I said, darn!
Yeah.
I had to get out of this business.
Yeah.
And that got me into being a faculty member. My wife studied instructional design at Purdue with Jim Russell and Sam Postaway. She's one of Sam Postaway's students.
Yeah.
Did the audio
tutorial method.
And
yeah.
she's still pushing it today.
Yeah.
And I actually have adapted it for for distance ed.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, audio tutorial, that paper that I sent you not that long ago, I mean, when you think about using podcasts, I mean, that's audio tutorial.
It is.
Yeah.
And people don't understand it. And you can make, but the audio tutorial had the nice interactive effect to it.
Yes.
That a podcast is typically a lecture.
Right.
But go back to some of Postal Waite's,
Sure, with the
baskets of plants and stuff,
yeah, the material,
and exercises and the music and all, and stop it and say, hey, think about this. Stop the tape, write it down, and come back on, and there's Postal Waite talking to you one-on-one. Well, here's what I came up with. How does that compare to yours?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that was back in the 60s. We don't need it anymore. Hey, it still works.
Yeah.
And my students actually love it. They like those better than the recorded PowerPoints.
You know, it's interesting too, because we talk about things that impact our field. So I'm not a toys and technology tools person, but I realize the importance of that because of my wife. And so my students are developing instructional materials this semester, but they're multimedia, individual. A lot of them are going to use Captivate or Articulate Storyline. And it's really essential we teach the current skills to our students, knowing they're going to change next year or 5 years down the road. But I think it really does boil down to the notion of how do we teach them to think systemically? How do we get them to solve problems? How do we get them to interact with people? You know, I mean, people who can't work well with other people, can't work with subject matter experts. So giving them those skills.
And that's the one
critical.
thing, I think that's one thing we miss. We don't, and I've always said, you know, we need to teach our students how to be a leader so they can set up a meeting and lead a meeting and get it to go where they want it to go. I mean, you got 4 subject matter experts in, you're doing a goal analysis, task analysis, you got to keep them on track.
Right.
You got to keep them focused, and then those two that are about to tear each other's eyeballs out, you've got to learn to control that.
Yeah.
Except when it comes to chemists. I found that you get 2 chemists in a room, they disagree. You bring a third one in, you get a third point of view. And you bring a fourth one in, you get a fourth point of view. So kids, stay away from the chemist, you know. Don't do a chemistry project.
One of the most fun courses that I teach is performance analysis. And so they go into real organizations and they work with real people and they collect data to try to suggest to them how to solve problems. And it's fascinating. We went into a no-kill animal shelter once. We went into a pharmacy and a hospital. We went into a school board. It's early days of internet, and they decided that they were going to pay teachers to design instruction that they could then use. But teachers wouldn't have control over their instruction because they were paying them for the product. And do you know what the #1 barrier to that was in that project? The teachers union. They were like, you can't pay people like that. That's against our contracts. And you don't think of things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But when you do a systems analysis, you find that out.
Well, it's interesting. I was either the TA or I was teaching Harold Stolovich when he was in Indiana. He had enough money to go for a master's project. And so and go for the doctorate. I said, well, you can get an assistantship. You can? Well, yes. I introduced him to Tyagi, who had an assistantship.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tyagi's fun.
Do they consider me the grandfather of HPT?
Well, I tell you what, I had a student one time. She introduced me. I was her major professor, and she said to me, in a crowd of people, because I was making a presentation, she says, I just want you to know that I was the first instructional designer to be hired by the University of Phoenix. And now look, there's 200 of us. And I thought, I wonder if that's something that I should be proud of. I introduced instructional design to the University of Phoenix.
I always tell my students, if you ever go work for a telemarketing company, I will take away your degree. But, I'm talking about students, my advisor always had a group of students over for popcorn and beer on Friday nights every year. I mean, just constantly, every weekend pretty much. And after he retired, when he came to Memphis one time to visit his daughter who lived just a few miles from me, I found out, I said, he always loved interacting with students. So I said, come on over, we're going to do a Friday night thing like you used to, except we're going to be more students. I think the greatest compliment one of my students paid him is, I'm your intellectual grandchild. Second generation.
Yeah. I do that now. I have a monthly potluck at my house, and all of the doctoral students I work with come over, and it was funny because we began, and I said, I want to have a research interest group. I'll have a meeting at my house. And so I invited the doctoral students that I was working with, and I put a piece of paper and pencil in front of everybody's desk, and I said, okay, what are our goals? And Allison Moore, who was one of the winners of the Pacific Corps competition, she says, well, let's have fun. And I said, okay, everybody write fun down. and I said, well, all right, what was another one of our goals? And well, we had just had this massive potluck dinner with people, food from all over the world, you know. So somebody says, well, I think we should eat well. And I said, okay, everybody write down eat well. And I said, anything else? And they're all quiet. And I said, well, how about research?
No.
And they're like, oh yeah, that's right, that's why we're here. And I said, all right, so let's set a goal. And everybody at the table will have a conference presentation by next year. Now, you could be a first author, a second author, but everybody at this table will be, you know, this is my first year at FSU, right? Because you got to get students. And so, you know, we made that goal, and now we've got them publishing in the literature together, and it's fun. But so every month we get together and do that. And so I have to come up with this fun activity for them because that's one of the goals. So one time I made an activity in which we took the acronyms in the field. So my wife and I sat around for a while. I was like, well, okay, WBT, ILT, VILT, ISPI, you know? And so we wrote them on the cards, and we passed them out, and they had to name their... Another time we had, you know, the game where you have a famous name taped to your back, but you don't know who it is. People have to ask questions. And so we use names in the field. So, you know, hey, they wanted to have fun.
Great.
So what are you going to do with retirement, Gary?
What am I going to do? First, we're going to sell our house. We're going to move to Bloomington, Indiana. I grew up there just south in Bedford, about 22 miles south of Bloomington, and I love the hills of southern Indiana.
Yeah.
And my hobby is landscape photography, which I've been doing more and more of. So I got a good friend who's a professional landscape photographer in Virginia, and I've spent 2 different weeks with him going out doing photography and getting some great shots, learning a lot. I'm going to do some consulting where I'll be working again with Steve Ross.
Yeah.
Doing some work with him, and we have an I-3 grant at ODU that goes for 2 more years. So I'll be doing that.
Okay.
I found out that every state has what's called a naturalist accreditation program, certification program. You learn about plants, wildlife, and geology. And I thought that could help me with my photography.
Yeah.
So I may do that in Virginia. I'm able to get that in this spring, and then I'll definitely do one in Indiana. And if you have it, if I get bored, I can get a job as a seasonal park ranger. You know, if I need something else to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got actually 3 papers that I want to finish off. I've sort of started.
You going to do any more of the book, or are you going to tell them no?
I think I would like to do one more edition, and hopefully I think that may start next year.
Yeah.
But there's a few things I want to tweak in it. That'll be the 8th edition.
Yeah.
I haven't told Steve yet, but I talked to Phil about doing the getting started in instructional technology, which I actually get more feedback on that than anything I've ever written.
Oh.
From people in the field.
I use it.
So
my students read it.
Well, we're going to expand it. You know, you wrote one of the articles, that special issue that I did.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to get permission to put those 4 articles, I think 4 or 5 articles in, and then put Steve and mine's original getting started, not the In Search of the Happy Medium, the first issue of ETR&D in 1989.
Yeah.
Because he and my daughter did a follow-up to it.
Okay.
Which after I saw it, I told him I didn't have time to work on it. After I saw the article, I said, darn, I should have said I'd have time to do that, you know?
Yeah.
We're putting that in. And then I teach an advanced design class. There's no book, so the students read abstracts from the research each week.
Right.
And I have them write a 2-page abstract, or they read an article and they write a 2-page abstract. And over the years, I've collected my responses, because they're the same every semester, basically, but, you know, how to focus in, APA style, things like that. And one of my students said, why don't you publish that? So I got to think, between Steve and I think we could take those as a basis and write another chapter of that book of, you know, sort of putting pencil to paper, so to speak, and errors to avoid, and just little things that people don't pick up in APA, some of the more subtle things that they may not know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things like et al.
Et al. With a period.
Yeah,
at the end.
Yeah.
And you know,
this is exciting. You want to keep talking about it et al? Let's see, we can move on to something else. I'm gonna warm my hands by this. This is like a fire. Did you notice how the reflects off? It's like, I thought maybe we were...
Fireplace chat.
Yeah, fireside chat.
Fireside
Very
chat.
good.
We changed
Yeah.
the name of it.
Yeah.
Actually, that's probably going to be the first project I tackle.
Yeah, yeah.
And do because I can do the updates fairly quickly and get that one out of the way, and get the other parts in. But those articles I think are really valuable, and they say a lot, and so I really want to get those in.
Well, the getting started and the one about how to put a conference proposal together and stuff like that. I have my students read that stuff all the time.
I go back and look at it myself when I'm doing one. I give it to my students and say, look, here's a formula for doing it. It's very successful. And this is what they want. Follow it.
Well, the paper that Bob and I wrote for your special issue, I showed it to a couple people on my department. And they're like, can we use this in your class? And I said, well, yeah, I was going to use it in mine. And they're like, well, maybe they should see it more than once, But I thought that whole special issue was good.
Yeah, I hope people read it because I enjoyed. I got some really top-notch scholars to write it for us, and I think it has a lot to say to the field, or any field. But going back to getting started instruction technology book.
Right.
When we first wrote that, we were talking about overhead transparencies, and then it transferred to. Okay, you have PowerPoint, but don't trust the darn projector. Bring an extra set of overhead transparencies with you.
Yeah.
And the last time we did it, we took the overhead transparencies out.
One of the fun activities I did training to be an elementary school teacher was bulletin boards.
Oh, yeah.
Creating bulletin boards. And then my daughter, who's training to be a high school English teacher, was talking to me the other day, and she said something about really enjoying bulletin boards. Here's what's fun, though. My daughter comes home, and she says, Dad, I learned something cool today. And I said, what's that? And she says, the ARCS model. I said, oh, yeah. John was my major professor. She's like, okay.
Well, I had the same experience because my daughter went through the doctorate program at ODU.
Right.
My wife used to get mad at us because before I'd go to bed, she'd come down and start talking about something. I said, well, have you read this, 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 and this? Well, no. Don't talk to me until you've read it.
Yeah.
I get up next morning, we'd have our breakfast, and then she'd come down and have breakfast. We'd start talking again. She had read those articles that night. And so my wife finally got frustrated, said she needs to find her own place. But as you'll see with your daughter, to watch their mind develop, it's just, to me, that's one of the most gratifying experiences because I was able to interact and see her daily, on a daily basis, have these conversations that, because we're a distance program, I don't get to have with students.
Right,
so
right.
It was really neat to do and watch her mind develop and see where she was going based on the materials I'd recommended she read and others had recommended she read.
Yeah, we keep telling, my wife and I keep telling her we're going to turn her into an instructional designer. She said, no, I'm going to be an English teacher for the rest of my life. And I said, well, it's a good introductory job. So.
Well, I remember going down to Florida State with her when she was an undergrad. And I had the message design book with me because I was doing a lecture.
Yeah.
And so I was reading something in it, and I said, look, take a look at this. She said, that's kind of interesting. And then I think she met Bob Reeser later that day. And she talked with him. I thought, this kid's going to become a designer eventually. It took a while, but she realized it.
Yeah. Well, it certainly has been, it's a charmed life.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
I've never looked back from making the decision to move
I've been to
back
3, well, counting the one we're on now, I've been to 4 continents. It's a charmed life and all the freedom that we have and the ability to work with smart people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, peers and students both.
Thank you, Gary, for everything you've done, man.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your contributions.
All right.